We did not put any undue influence or pressure. It is extremely important to highlight that it is only the RCMP, it is only police that determine what and when to release information. The commissioner's statement, the minister's statement were very clear on that. And yes, I still very much have confidence in Commissioner Leckie.
The House has wrapped now for its summer break, and as you heard there, the Prime Minister being forced to defend both the RCMP Commissioner and his own government against allegations of political interference. Just one of many challenges the Liberals are dealing with as they head off for the summer. So how are they handling all of it? It's Thursday, and at issue is here. Chantal Hébert, Elamine Abdul-Mahmoud, Althea Raj, and Andrew Coyne. Good to see everybody. Appreciate you being here. Let's sort of go, we'll start with Chantal on this. I mean, we could start with this latest controversy this week, but there's all sorts of challenges facing the government right now that it's having to manage, Chantal.
Yeah, passport lineups. It looks like a homeless camp where they issue passports in Montreal. I've never seen the likes of it. Picnic tables, tents, people trying to get passports. Sounds pretty basic. Trans Mountain Pipeline, not according to the budget officer, the parliamentary budget officer, not going to be paying back the money that has been invested into it. Go down the list, and what you have is certainly a sigh of relief for Parliament to wind down, but certainly not where the Liberals would have wanted to be at this point, which I believe is inertia, serious trouble, complacency, and worse than that, competence issues now being raised, which is probably the most deadly thing to be raised about the government.
And Andrew, Chantal didn't even mention inflation, which is, of course, the other big thing that's going to continue for weeks ahead. But you go ahead with what you think are the challenges.
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, nothing, as we've seen in previous decades, can be more lethal for a government's chances than to be governing in times of inflation. But it's also been a very bad few weeks for them generally. You know, people will put up with and have put up with a lot from this government, whether it's in terms of cynicism or doctrinal ideology or the moral vanity or even some of the ethical failings. But when you start talking about basic questions of competence, things like the airport mess or the passports mess, now compound that with a couple of, at the very least, serious allegations of abuse of power, whether we're talking about lying to Parliament about the Emergencies Act, or in this latest instance, interfering in a criminal investigation, allegedly, for political ends, which, let's just say, fits a pattern. This all put together is extremely serious business.
Althea, do you think it's that bad right now for them, or that there's a lot of bumps on the road?
There's a lot of bumps, but there are things like Marco Mendicino, the public safety minister, misleading Canadians about whether or not law enforcement had specifically recommended the Emergencies Act. In this case, the Brenda Leckie, the RCMP commissioner, whether or not there was some direction or some discussion with the Prime Minister's office, Bill Blair, who was then the public safety minister. These seem to be things that the government should be purposefully avoiding to do. Interest rates, inflation, I would even add to that the climate targets, like they haven't announced the steps in order to reach their 2030 targets. They do not seem like they're going to be viable at all. Like the government needs to refocus, pare down, and implement the things that they wanted to do, and then kind of tell us why we had an election in the first place last fall, because it's not really clear.
Well, I don't know that we knew that during the election either, but Elamine, what do you think are some of the challenges for the government right now?
Well, I think one interesting thing about each of these crises that we named, and we've named about half a dozen so far, is that each one of them confirms exactly the worst thing that people think about this government. Like, it's not only the fact that these are crises; it's that the crises of sort of the sort of mirror how people think about the government in their worst days. So when we think about, for example, the competency issues at the airports, like people kind of expect governments to kind of mess up airports, and they're in fact doing exactly that, or at least they're not handling that appropriately. And then when we look at the situation with the RCMP commissioner, that's the kind of story that kind of confirms what the worst things that people think about the Liberals on their worst days are. And so those crises kind of compound to kind of lead us to this moment where you might say that this government has been narrativeless for some time. They've not really put forth a story, probably since that agreement that Althea just mentioned. Like I think that's the last sort of meaningful story that the government's kind of put forward in terms of what their plans are going to be looking forward. And since then, they've kind of just been adrift based on that.
But they do have things to talk about, Chantal. Like there was a budget with lots of things in it that we haven't really heard much about since then. So what is leading to the lack of focus and the other issues that we've been talking about here?
The sense that this is a prime minister and a government that spent 2 years saying we have your backs on the pandemic, and is now trying to say that on the budget and fiscal policy, and it seriously doesn't feel that way. There's a sense out there that the government is missing in action. So I spent the week talking to people who like the Liberals, and there are two things, two schools of thought. The shape up school, you do something over the summer and shape up, but the ship out school about the prime minister was larger, and that can't be good.
No. Andrew, what does that mean then for the months ahead for him? I mean, he's on a long overseas trip right now at a number of summits, which usually helps a prime minister too, just to get out of the country.
Well, the rethinking is going to have to be pretty fundamental, because for the first X number of years of its existence, this government's basically had one gear and one plan, which is spend, and spend some more. You're getting to a stage now with the inflation rate being where it's at, where even people who might be sympathetic to that at other times are saying you've got to rein it in. I will say, however, that the blessing they have is the opposition, the quote unquote government in waiting, should be showing itself off to maximum advantage, where it should be showing itself as being the reasonable alternative to the government, is running a clown show of a leadership race, where instead of talking about serious and substantive policies that they would enact, they're talking about conspiracy theories and is the World Economic Forum running the country and these kinds of nonsense. So they're getting the usual liberal luck in the form of their opposition.
Althea?
I would say for now, though, because in the fall, there will be a brand new leader on September 10th. That is going to change the dynamic in the House of Commons. They're going to come out swinging. You're going to have a Quebec election with an incumbent premier that seems to want to fight Justin Trudeau. Well, he doesn't really have many opponents in the province, but probably explains why he wants to fight Justin Trudeau. So it's going to be much more difficult. I think the problem on the inflation front is that the Liberals want to have it both ways. You know, they ran on helping the middle class and those wanting to join it. They ran on the pandemic, as Chantal mentioned, and now they do seem to have the instincts to want to help people. But at the same time, Minister Freeland wants to show that she can be fiscal, she can show fiscal restraint, and she can be responsible. And those two things are contradictory, but frankly, they are also contradictory in the Conservative bench. I mean, just this question period today on Thursday, you had one question demanding more support and another question saying you were spending too much. So none of the parties really have a good answer to that.
Elamy?
That may be true, but I think Pierre Poilievre has been very good at sort of articulating the street level frustration with this government, at least when it comes to inflation. And he was, in fact, way ahead on this, whether he was correct about the reasons or not. He does kind of get to look back at that record and say, if he indeed becomes the leader, he gets to look back at that record and say, you know what, I've been advancing this message since day one. And I think that is a worry for this government, because if he has been the person saying it longest, and this government is sort of giving speeches that feel very out of touch with how people are feeling about inflation, that already puts him on the back foot.
For me, I've probably encountered about 20 death threats which have been forwarded to the police. There have been some who have been, a few who have been convicted.
I carry one all the time. Yeah, and I worry about my children, I worry about my family, I worry about my constituency staff, my staff on the Hill.
If someone doesn't feel safe in the execution of their duties, we should have a conversation about it.
MPs, they're talking about various threats and challenges they face today. Some of them, as you heard there, have begun to carry panic buttons. What does that tell us about the state of political discourse in this country? At Issue is back. Chantal, Elamine, Andrew, and Althea. Elamine, I'm going to start with you on this front. I mean, I think we know that politicians have long been targets of threats as public figures, but it does feel like something is a little different, and I wonder how troubling it is and how worried we should be about that level of discourse and rhetoric.
We've seen some research that suggests that a lot of the polarization in this country is among generational lines. So the idea that there are younger generations who no longer feel like government is working for them. I don't know what that says about our current democracy. I don't know what that says about people's trust in government. We're living through this moment where people are, suffering from inflation. The relationship to government has been fundamentally altered, and I'm not sure I'm seeing anyone, whether it's the opposition or the government, speaking to that, speaking to, past the policy and into the emotion of how people are relating to government at the moment. And I have to say that can't be making the problem any better.
It's interesting, Chantal, because I don't think there's been a time, certainly in my lifetime, where government has felt so present because of the support and the things that it was doing to keep us all sort of alive. But it does seem as though that has shifted in some people's minds too.
I think we are at a point in at least the national cycle when people are looking for leadership at the time when the expiry date on the government is in a cyclic way coming to a close. But I also think that politicians on both sides of the House, I'm not naming a party, have spent so much time over the past 2 decades talking about each other across the aisle as if they were all crooks, people who are only in this business for their own interests, that at some point they have managed to convince a lot of people that whoever is on the other side of the aisle is not there for public service. And they, in so doing, are shooting themselves in the foot. But for short-term gain, all parties have been playing that game, and now it's going to come back to haunt them for a long time.
Andrew?
What we're dealing with right now, when we're talking about threats to the life and safety of MPs, is something I think new. I think it is in part due to the advent of social media, and which is quite unprecedented in the way in which it enables people to find each other online, to radicalize each other, to buttress each other's beliefs, to whip each other up into a frenzy. And the type of language you hear there that so exaggerates the quote-unquote threat, for example, represented by the government. I mean, I've got a lot of criticism of the government. I don't think it's a dictatorship. I don't think it's about to throw us all into a dark night of tyranny. But that kind of language often, is used to justify to oneself, extreme actions are justified in response to this. And then when you have political leaders who ought to be tamping that down and ought to be finding ways to channel that into more useful things, whipping up the rhetoric themselves. When you have Maxime Bernier, for example, calling the Prime Minister a fascist psychopath repeatedly online, and some of the other exaggerated rhetoric out there, I would be worried.
30 seconds to you, Althea.
It is incumbent on leaders to lead, unfortunately. For example, this week we had 20 or so Conservative MPs who met with some of the Freedom Convoy members. One of them, who was involved in the February event, talked about Canada being close to a civil war. And the Twitter thread talks about the illegitimate election of Justin Trudeau, that Justin Trudeau had cheated. It is incumbent on those MPs to clamp down on that and say that that is not true. We have fair elections. Elections Canada is known around the world for conducting fair elections. So it is also incumbent on the government, frankly, though, to also speak truthfully. When they do not speak truthfully, people lose trust, and trust is at the center of all of this.
Okay, on that note, a heavy topic, important conversation. I'm going to say goodbye to you for the summer, hopefully. Not because I don't love you and won't miss you, I will. But we're going to take a little summer hiatus. Thank you all very much.